Good morning. I'd invite you to open your Bibles to Romans chapter 12. We're going to be continuing our series that we've been looking at once a month in this great chapter. And I know that Mike and Stephanie miss all of you very much right now. They're on a vacation in Maine, and they look forward to being back next week. Mike wanted me to make sure that I announced that that's why they're not here this morning. Would those closest to you describe you as somebody who is sympathetic? If you're somebody who is sympathetic, it's somebody you would be somebody who shares and understands the feelings of other people. What would the people that are closest to you say about that? Being this kind of person is not just a personality trait. It's not just, well, you're kind of this sort of person and I'm this sort of person. This is something that's commanded of Christians. This is not really one of those optional sort of things. This is something that, as Christ wants us to adopt his character qualities, this is one of the things that he wants us to have. And probably more than likely in your life, the people who have had the most profound impact on you are people who learned to be sympathetic with you. Those are the people who, whenever they did have some kind of criticism or correction in your life, it went further than anybody else who would not be sympathetic towards you. These are the kind of people that help shoulder your burdens, so that when you feel like you're weighed down with a lot of things, they help carry some of the load. These are the people that you would share your deepest struggles with. Are you that kind of person? If you know that you've been blessed by people like that, one of the responsibilities we would have is to be a blessing to those around us and pattern ourselves after that same example. But I want to remind us as we look at this that in Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2, this is like the heading, the way of thinking about this whole series. Romans 12, 1 and 2, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. The motor in your car that got you here this morning is what powered your car to get here. When you think about motor and you compare it to the word motive, I don't know if they're like related grammatically or whatever, but it's an interesting way to think about what drives your life. The decisions that you make, the way that you interact with other people, the way that you show love to other people or show sympathy to other people, all of these things are stemming from your motives. Your motives are what drives your actions. And as we've been looking at this series, we've been seeing that the motive that we have to serve God and to be a living sacrifice is found in verse 1. It's by the mercies of God. God has been so merciful and so good to us, and this is one of the things that we've been seeing in every one of these lessons from one angle or another, that in light of how good he's been to us, we should have a motive of pleasing God in return and offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. We've said a lot about this verse as we've been going through this, but here's the schedule of what we've been looking at. The purpose of these lessons is not just to get us to ponder and reason through different things, but to actually do them. The lesson that we did in February was not just about thinking about the concept of different gifts that we can use for the Lord, but it's to think about them as so to begin doing them. Or brotherly affection. It wasn't just, oh, yes, interesting thoughts about brotherly affection and how we're supposed to be a family, but it's to actually do these things. Today, in September, we're looking at this idea of mutually rejoicing and weeping with people. In other words, being sympathetic. The reason for this lesson this morning is not for us to just learn some new things or think about some things in some new ways. It's to do those things, but unto the purpose of living them out as we seek to be living sacrifices. I want to just go ahead and read Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 16, and this is going to be in the section that we're looking at this morning. Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 16. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. At the end of the year, Lord willing, we're going to talk about verse 14, about overcoming evil with good. But what we're looking at in this lesson is verse 14 and the beginning of verse 15, where we're supposed to have harmony with one another. We're supposed to rejoice and weep. And before I get into the heart of this lesson, I just want to offer a disclaimer. The Bible says here to rejoice and weep with people. Are there ever times, though, when somebody might be rejoicing about something and I should not rejoice with them? Or somebody else might be weeping about something and I should not weep with them? There would be times like that. 1 Corinthians 13 talks about how love does not rejoice at wrongdoing. I'm not going to rejoice when somebody's celebrating some sin in their life. That's a responsibility of mine to not rejoice with somebody in that situation. Or what about weeping? Say that somebody has built their life around some kind of idol, some kind of thing that they've put above God, and that thing finally lets them down. Should I have sympathetic weeping with them? Well, you should maybe weep that it came to that point, but you almost have more hope in that situation, and maybe joy in a deep way, because perhaps their idolatry will finally let them down and they'll come back to the Lord. So I just want to say that there's a disclaimer to that at the beginning of this lesson. There's other passages in Scripture that would say that rejoicing and weeping is not something that we mutually do in every circumstance. There would be times where we wouldn't do that. But for the rest of this lesson, for the totality of this lesson, I'm coming at it from the perspective of when we should weep with somebody and when we should rejoice with somebody. How do we do this? And the first thing that I want us to think about in this lesson is how is it that rejoicing and weeping or being sympathetic is valuable? So here's Paul writing this letter that is going to be read out loud to the church at Rome. And he's saying, this is a virtue. This is a noble thing to pursue. Well, how is it the case that this is such an important thing that local churches get figured out, that they do these things? How is this valuable? And there's a couple different things that I can think of with this. Number one, this is valuable because it evokes companionship amongst Christians. Back in May, we talked about the importance of brotherly love, brotherly affection. Have you ever had a time before where you were weeping or you were rejoicing about something and nobody shared that emotion with you? And what that caused in you was deep loneliness. One of the expectations of God's people is that when one part of the body is hurting, we hurt with them. When another part of the body is rejoicing, we rejoice with them. What if there's one person that's rejoicing in something but nobody's with them in that? Or there's somebody that's shedding a tear about something and nobody's with them in that. One of the reasons why we need to see this as a valuable thing is because it's good, obviously, for the person that's rejoicing or weeping. I remember a few months back when my grandfather passed away. He was a few days before turning 100 years old. And Asher and I drove up to Minnesota, 13 hours. And on the trip up there, many of you were texting me or calling me, sending condolences. That was a hard time. You guys know about my family background and whether or not I've got family members that are in the Lord. And a lot of you were thoughtful about that sort of thing, and that was encouraging and helpful to me. Have you ever had a time before, though, that you were weeping over something and nobody sent any cards, nobody sent any texts, nobody called you at all, and this weeping that you were experiencing, because nobody shared in it with you, you felt all the more lonely? Okay, well, that maybe that one's kind of obvious, that when somebody's weeping, we do that with other people. But do we sometimes neglect that when it comes to mutually rejoicing with people? Yeah, like, okay, somebody's weeping, give them attention. Somebody's rejoicing, they don't need as much companionship in that moment. Except that the text says we've got to do both of them. Have you ever had a time before where you were ecstatic about something and you tried to share it with other people and you wanted other people to be happy for you and with you, but when they didn't show that to you, it caused you to feel like you weren't part of a family? C.S. Lewis, in his book Reflections on the Psalms, said this: "I think we delight to praise what we enjoy because the praise not merely expresses but completes the enjoyment. It is its appointed consummation. It is not out of compliment that lovers keep telling one another how beautiful they are. The delight is incomplete till it is expressed." The idea being that when you've been excited about something, you've got to talk about it. And when people want to be a wet blanket on the things that you're excited about, it makes you feel like you can't share things with those people anymore. Think about some examples of this. There's an older Christian that I knew when I lived in Tennessee, and he was telling me a story about a member at a church when he lived in Arkansas. There was a guy at a church that had made a good amount of money. He had done it ethically, all that kind of thing. And he built a nice house for himself. And he had some people from the church over to his house, and the only thing that they could say was, "I can't relate to that wealth. Why do you guys have that in the house? Why do you have this? It's kind of elaborate, don't you think?" And they had a couple people over that kept making comments like this. And then my friend, when they went over to the house, they said, "Wow, this is great. I'm so happy for you." And then the couple that had the house just started crying. And they said, "You're the first people to tell us that. Because everybody else that we've had into our home from the church have had to make some kind of criticism about it. If you saw somebody else rejoicing over something that you even didn't have, would you have the love for that person to rejoice with them, or would you want to alienate them?" There's another example that we could think of this. Somebody who's been seeking to raise their children in the Lord. Finally, one day, one of those kids decides to be baptized into Christ, and mom and dad are rejoicing. Do you come to mom and dad and rejoice with them? Do you see how we know it's important to weep with those who weep, but do we see the importance of rejoicing with those who rejoice for the sake of that person so that they don't feel lonely in the midst of it? So this is one way that this is valuable. It evokes companionship amongst God's people. It creates a family atmosphere like we looked at back in May. But here's another way that this is valuable, is that rejoicing and weeping evokes harmony amongst God's people. I've heard so many horror stories of church splits over and over and over again, and it makes me wonder that sometimes it seems like Christians are better at doing splits than gymnasts or something like that. Some splits, I think, are necessary. It's over doctrinal issues that cannot be crossed over. There cannot be a way of working things through together. But you think about the audience of the book of Romans. Did they have problems with potential disharmony? Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul's not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to salvation for the Jew first and also the Greek. Jew, Greek, Jew, Gentile, Jew, Greek. This is a phrase that's used several times throughout the book. Romans chapter 10, verse 12, "For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him." God says in this book, I make no distinction. In chapters 1 through 3, they're all equally under sin, and the rest of the book, they're all equally saved in the Lord. But were the members of this church in danger of making distinctions in these ways? In chapter 14, we've got the food fighting issues, where they're dividing over, the Jews came from this background, the Gentiles or the Greeks came from this background. And we're going to not work together because you guys have different dietary preferences that come back from your religious background. Can you imagine being in a church where all the members are fighting over one thing or another, and there's this faction and there's that faction? How about when the Greek faction is rejoicing over something, how is the Jewish faction feeling? They're maybe going to be tempted to not rejoice. And you invert that and put that into all the different permutations that it could be. Can you see how that would be a problem in a local church? We've got people that are making dividing lines over different kinds of things. And then this passage is saying, you rejoice and you weep together. Yeah, but those people came from a different background. I don't care. You guys learn to listen to each other, think about things together, and when somebody's emoting in some way, you get into their shoes and you experience what they're going through by imagining it. Do you suppose that a lot of church splits have happened. Because there is a couple factions in a church, and they didn't learn to rejoice and weep with one another. They didn't ever learn to think about things from somebody else's perspective. One of the ways that this is valuable is because this evokes harmony amongst God's people. And I believe that if every Christian in every local church tried to figure out how to do this in their life and they did it, there would be a lot more harmony amongst God's people. Here's another reason why this would be valuable, is that it evokes selflessness. So if in the first couple things, if it evokes companionship and it's good for the person to not feel alienated, and loneliness is a problem in our society, by the way, partly because people aren't figuring out how to do this. So if it's good for the person that's rejoicing or weeping, it's also good for the body of God's people that we would have harmony with one another, which is, by the way, I forgot to mention this, that Romans 12:16 starts to talk about living in harmony with one another. It's the next thing that he talks about, so it helps us with that. So if it's good for other people individually, it's good for the local church, it's also good for you to learn to rejoice and weep with people when they're going through good or bad things. One of our natural tendencies is to want to be the center of attention to things. Have you ever had a time before where you were weeping over something, you were saddened over something, and then somebody had to come and one-up your suffering? You know what I mean by that? My car broke down. I had 6 cars that broke down in 1 hour. School's really hard. In my day, I had 40 hours worth of homework every night. And I didn't have a bus that would take me. I had to ride my bike, and the bike was always broken and rusty. You know what I mean by that? Or somebody, hey, I'm really happy, like I got this new car. I got a better one. I paid cash for mine. You making monthly payments on that one? I bet you are. You know what I mean? Where somebody's got some reason to be excited or they've got some reason to be sad, and people are flocking to that person, and you're standing there going, come on. Is everybody forgetting about me right now? If I learned to really rejoice and weep with other people and not do it the way that an actor would, where you're pretending to do it with somebody, if I really learned how to do this, do you think it would cause me to overcome jealousy, self-centeredness, bitterness, all kinds of things like that? This is a virtue that's good for me. And you can think about a couple examples in the scriptures of people who didn't overcome it. They didn't learn how to do this. In Acts 3 and 4, remember when Peter and John, they heal Mr. Crippled Man who is crippled for 40 years? And after that guy is healed, Peter gives a sermon about the explanation on this event. And in chapter 4, some of the apostles are arrested. And look at the Jewish leadership and what they're doing here in Acts chapter 4, verse 21. And when they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding no way to punish them because of the people, for all were praising God for what had happened. So here's the Jewish leadership. And that, well, our hands are tied because everybody's like rejoicing and praising God that this guy that was paralyzed from his mother's womb for 40 years, he's been able to walk again, and everybody's rejoicing. What are we supposed to do about these apostles? Look at the attitude that they have. Everybody's rejoicing. We want them to stop, but we can't do anything about it. Notice the next chapter, by the way, in Acts 5, 17 and 18, when the apostles keep preaching. It says, but the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in public prison. What are they filled with? Have you ever had a time before where somebody was rejoicing over something? There was some great thing that happened. And the only thing you were filled with was a sour attitude of jealousy. Because I don't have the attention that those people have. I don't have the blessings that those people have. I don't have the things that those people, I don't have the charmed life like that person has. And the only thing that you can think about is yourself. By the way, I I've tried to think about this before, and I've wondered if this is the case. Most sin in the Bible, most sin that the Bible talks about, and the Bible says this, has momentary pleasure. That's why people commit the sin, is because there's momentary pleasure in it. Can you think of any momentary pleasure in jealousy or envy? I can't. Maybe when you're the one on top and you're the one who's got more than other people, you've got momentary pleasure in that time. But the sin of jealousy and envy just leaves you as this sour person that all the world can be rejoicing, but because you're not the center of it, you're just going to be upset about it. What about when somebody's weeping, though? You can think, our hearts can do such wicked things that when somebody else is weeping, we can be rejoicing. Matthew chapter 6, verse 2 says about the Pharisees, "Thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward." All right. Here's Jesus saying about the Pharisees, well, they give to the needy. So there's needy people that are weeping about something. And here's the Pharisees. Here's how they look at it. Oh, yes. Here's an opportunity for me to be the hero. Here's an opportunity for me to use the misfortunes of other people and get back into the driver's seat and get attention from everybody, and everybody will praise me for the ways that I've helped other people. Is it possible that when somebody's weeping, we can just be like an actor? And we're not really weeping with them. We're actually doing these things for them and looking around at the same time, hoping that everybody knows that I'm the center of the one that's helping them, and then I will get praise for that. That's not what Romans 12 is talking about. It's talking about sincere weeping, sincere rejoicing. Notice the last thing that this evokes out of us, though, is it evokes believing the best in other people. 1 Corinthians 13, where it talks about love, one of the things that it says is that love believes all things. What does it mean that love believes all things? I think it's the idea that unless there's clear evidence otherwise, you're just assuming the best about what other people are doing, how other people are rejoicing or weeping. Have you ever had a time before, though, where somebody was weeping about something and you're like, I'm not sure, or they were rejoicing about something and you were like, I'm not sure about that? Would you all agree that in any given situation, there's millions of perspectives that you can have on something? In any given circumstance, everything that somebody else is going through, there's a bunch of different perspectives you can have on it. If you're the kind of person who always has a sour outlook on what everybody else is experiencing all the time, ask yourself the question, why have you chosen that to be your perspective? Why is that the perspective that you have on everything? Probably says more about you than it does anybody else. When I really rejoice and weep with other people, I'm not criticizing every single thing about what's going on. I'm trying to think about how I can be happy with them and for them. And yes, if there's good reason to think otherwise, you talk to them about those things, you rebuke them. But if you're the kind of person that's just constantly sour about everything and about everybody, I would guarantee that you're not the kind of person that rejoices and weeps with other people. I think about Job's friends. Were Job's friends good at weeping with those who wept? In Job chapter 2, verse 11, now when Job's 3 friends had heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. They come initially with good motives, and then they sit there for like a week, and then they open their mouth, and they're not very sympathetic at all. And one interesting thing to do in the book of Job is to look at the 3 friends and try to track down what's the meanest thing that each one of them said. Zophar, I think, says the meanest thing that out of all the other friends, and it's found pretty early in the book in Job 11, verses 5 and 6. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom. For he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Can you imagine talking to somebody that's scraping dead skin with the potsherds and they've lost everything and Mrs. Job is not being nice to him. And then this guy says, you actually deserve worse than what you have. Wow. Why is it the case that Job's friends could not weep with Job? Because they just started to assume that you must have sinned. You must have done something wrong, Job, and that's why you're going through these difficulties. And by the way, sometimes is your suffering in life because you've made a bad decision. Yeah, sometimes that's the case. That's not always the case, though. But if I look at everybody that ever weeps about something and try to track it back to some bad decision they made, I will not be a sympathetic person. There's times for those conversations, but Job shows us that there's times that that's not the conversation to have. What about rejoicing? Have you ever seen somebody rejoicing about something and the only thing that you could think of, well, they're just trying to get attention for themselves. They're too worldly minded. They're too this, they're too that. And you're constantly thinking the worst about other people. There's no way that you could ever rejoice with anybody, no matter what it was that they were experiencing. Why have you chosen the perspectives that you have? There's a lot of ways to look at every situation. Why have you chosen to look at it the ways that you've been looking at it? Now, here's some ways that it's valuable. I want to finish this lesson by thinking a couple things about how to do this. So if these are the things that it evokes within us, that if I focus on these things, it's good for the individual, it's good for the church, it's good for me also to think the best about other people unless there's evidence otherwise. How do I do this? Just a few brief things to say about this. Number one is to match the emotion of the person. This is what the verse is saying to do, by the way. When people are rejoicing, you rejoice. When people are weeping, you weep. And so the text does not say, rejoice with those who weep. This is burned deep into my memory. Shortly after I became a Christian, and there's a lot of difficulties in my life, there was one day when I was parking at the college campus parking lot, and there was a girl that was getting out of her car at the same time, and we were friends, and we had gone to some Bible studies together. And as we were walking into the college, she had said, so how are you doing today? And I said, I'm really not doing very well at all, actually. Like, things are really difficult. I don't know why some of these sufferings are happening in my life. I'm trying to figure out how to handle it the best way. And she looked at me and cocked her head, and she said, don't you realize that every day in the Lord is a blessing? Do we ever do something like that? Where it's like we don't even give somebody the opportunity to be able to be sad about something. Can you think of being one of Job's friends? And in Job chapter 3, he curses the day that he was born. And here's a guy that was very mature spiritually. He was somebody that everybody respected. Have you ever seen anybody that you look up to say something like, curse the day that I was ever born? Can sometimes Christians have the right to say something like that? Is that okay sometimes? Yeah. Weep with them. It's not your job every time somebody's going through something really difficult to correct every single thing that you think they might need to have corrected. It's okay to just be there with somebody and cry with them. Or, inversely, the text does not say weep with those who rejoice. A couple other things burned in my memory. There's one time when I was not here, and there was somebody that I had been studying with that was baptized, and I got a conversation. I don't remember if it was a phone call. I think it was a phone call with one of the people in the church it was just one of the people in the church, and they said, I hope this guy's not bringing baggage into the church. So I thought Luke 15 said this was a time for rejoicing, and you want to be sour about this? Or there's another time that somebody was baptized and somebody just responded by saying, I sure hope they understood what they were doing. Match the emotion, fit the circumstance. Now that's the first thing, and this is just basically what the verse is saying. So notice the second thing. Imagine being in the situation of other people. Try putting yourself in their shoes is what people would say. And there's Bible verses that show this kind of idea. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3, remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you are also in the body. I think a lot of the reasons that I've struggled with being sympathetic at times is because I've been sitting there on a high horse thinking that I would know how to handle this situation. And if you try to think in terms of, can you imagine you're in prison because you're trying to serve the Lord? Really imagine being in their shoes. Imagine being in the situation of the person that's suffering and think, how would I act? How would I react? Would I really be doing things any better? Or would I be rejoicing the same way that they would be doing? Is that part of your mental discipline in how you think about other people? Or Paul uses the word rejoice in another passage in Romans 16:19. For your obedience is known to all, so that I rejoice over you. Here's Paul thinking about the obedience of these Christians and how people are being encouraged by it. And he's imagining, okay, these people are living in a difficult city, and people are rejoicing over their example, and I'm rejoicing over their example, and they're happy in the Lord, and this is something that gives me joy. This is basic advice. But how often do you imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes? Notice, third thing, is to be willing to make sacrifices. This is what this whole chapter is based on in Romans 12, that we're going to be living sacrifices. And if I'm unwilling to make sacrifices, I'm never going to be somebody who's going to get this figured out. There's a couple things that need to be sacrificed to make this happen. I need to be willing to sacrifice my time. If I don't ever have time for anybody, if I don't ever have time for a phone call, if I don't ever have time to respond to the needs of other people, I will not make myself available to even be able to do this. There's a church that I've done a couple meetings at in Indiana, and there's the first time I was ever there. It was like before even the first sermon that I did for them, and it was like the mingle time before everything was getting started. And there's this guy in the auditorium that pulled me aside, and he's like, hey, can I tell you something? And I was like, yeah, what's up? And he pointed over at one of the elders, and he said, do you see that guy over there? And I said, yeah, what about it? He said, that is one of the most amazing men I've ever known. I said, why do you say that? He said, well, there was one night when I was really struggling with something, and I called him, and he came straight from work to my house, and he stayed up all night with me, praying and thinking through things. All night he stayed up with me. And then the next morning, in the same clothes he came in the day before, he goes back to work without having had 1 hour of sleep. That's an extreme case. The guy was going through something extremely traumatic. But look at the influence and the impact that it had on that guy's life. Would you be willing to stay up later if you had to talk to somebody about something? Would you be willing to give up your time in that way? It also involves the sacrifice of your emotions. Some of us like to be people that have positive vibes all the time, and this is what positive vibe people do. Like, I just like positive vibes. And if I'm going to go talk to that person that's weeping, then I can't do this anymore. And they just kind of make me feel down because I like to feel up about things, and that person's always weeping or that person's going through something difficult. So why would I want to be around them and ruin my vibes that I got right now? Loving people and being living sacrifices means that you sacrifice your time and even your emotions. But notice the final way how to do this. Remember that in Romans 12, verse 1, it talks about the mercies of God. Everything in this chapter is founded on how good God has been to you. Is God asking us to do something in this passage that He's not done for us first? Has God wept when you wept? Everything we know about God and Jesus in the Bible, He came and He experienced human emotions. Hebrews chapter 5, He's a sympathetic high priest because He's experienced what people experience, and He's proven that to us. You think that when you're going through something difficult that God doesn't weep with you. You need to read the Gospels again. Does God rejoice with you? I'm reminded of Zephaniah 3, 14 and 17, where the prophet says, sing aloud, O daughter of Zion, Shout, O Israel, rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. That's an interesting phrase. He will exult over you with loud singing. Do you believe that? You've got at the beginning of this, the daughter of Zion, which is pictures ultimately of the church, of God's people. And they're rejoicing over what God has done, and God's sitting there like this. That's not the picture. They're rejoicing, and God is rejoicing and praising you, and He's saying all these great things in His joy for the decisions that you've made and for the way that He's cleaning you up. Do you see God as one who rejoices over you, or one that's got his arm cocked and he's ready to slap you across the face when you do something wrong? What's your picture of God? He weeps with you and he rejoices with you. And it's something that we've got to believe by faith. And as we believe that by faith, I think it's something that we're in turn able to show to other people. If there's anybody here this morning that's not right with God, know that God has emotions about what you're going through. That if you're somebody that's got cause to rejoice right now, He's rejoicing with you. If you're somebody that has reason to weep, He's weeping with you. This is an opportunity to get your life right with God and to become a follower of His like you ought to be. We're about to sing this song, There is a Habitation. There's a place that He's created for us to be with Him forever. And if we take the instructions that we've looked at this morning and we take them seriously, we can help other people be there one day as well. Let's be a blessing. And if there's anybody that has any needs, you can come forward while we stand and while we sing.